I stood at the threshold of the grand auditorium hall, my fingers tightly gripping a simple bouquet of yellow daisies. The woman who stole my life sat proudly in the seat reserved specifically for me, stroking the luxurious silk dress she thought my ex-husband designed himself. She had absolutely no idea she was about to receive a bitter lesson in front of thousands of people. That stitches woven from theft would soon unravel in the most ruthless way. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Violet Bell, and today was supposed to be a morning of pure, unadulterated triumph. The air inside the colossal Oak Haven High School auditorium hummed with the electric, restless anticipation of hundreds of proud families. I navigated slowly through the suffocating sea of expensive perfumes, imported colognes, and sharply tailored suits. My own worn out, practical shoes made hardly a sound against the impeccably polished mahogany floor. In my hands, I held a very modest bouquet of bright yellow daisies. They were Leo's absolute favorite, chosen specifically by me because they represented the bright, unyielding resilience he and I had painstakingly built together. The flowers were incredibly simple, costing me exactly $12 at the small local florist down the street from our apartment. Yet to me, they were worth infinitely more than all the ostentatious, towering floral arrangements currently crowding the grand aisles. I walked deliberately down the long central aisle toward the very front row. The prestigious guest section was clearly cordoned off with thick maroon velvet ropes and polished brass stanchions. Leo had made a special point of telling me he had personally secured a seat for me right in the absolute center, directly in his line of sight from the main stage. He had even spent time printing a small, elegant name card. I could see the row of reserved seats approaching, my chest swelling with a quiet, fierce pride. After 18 grueling years of endless struggle, my brilliant son was graduating as the high school valedictorian. This was our shared, hard-fought victory. But as I finally reached the designated spot, the breath violently caught in my throat. The plush seat bearing my printed name was completely occupied. Eleanor, the extraordinarily wealthy and impossibly entitled woman who had seamlessly replaced me in my former husband's life, was settled comfortably into the velvet cushion. She wore a stunning, bespoke silk dress, its intricate, shimmering woven patterns catching the bright stage lights overhead. It was a magnificent design I knew intimately, a complex pattern born directly from my own calloused, bleeding hands many years ago. Eleanor haughtily adjusted her heavy diamond necklace, lazily noticed my arrival, and looked up at me. Her perfectly manicured lips slowly twisted into a cruel, condescending smirk. "Oh, Violet," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with an arrogant, sugary sweetness that gratingly rubbed against my ears. "We simply assumed you would be sitting far back in the general admissions section with the rest of the working class. Arthur and I are the primary financial sponsors of the Valedictorian Scholarship Fund this year, so it is only fitting that we take the primary sponsor seating arrangement. Be a dear and find somewhere else to stand. You are currently blocking the view for the important guests." I shifted my cold gaze to the man sitting directly beside her. Arthur, my ex-husband, the man who had systematically taken my raw talent, my youth, and my original designs to ruthlessly build his luxury fashion empire, only to discard me like trash when he finally reached the pinnacle of commercial success. He did not even have the basic human decency to look me in the eye. Instead, he sat completely rigidly in his excessively expensive tailored charcoal suit, pretending to be deeply and thoroughly engrossed in reading the 4-page graduation ceremony program. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the thick parchment paper, cowardly avoiding the harsh reality of my physical presence. The familiar burning sting of profound injustice flared deep in my chest, hot and overwhelmingly suffocating. Before I could formulate a sharp response that maintained my fragile dignity, a heavy, commanding hand gently touched my right shoulder, I slowly turned to face a towering, broad-shouldered security guard. His facial expression was extremely polite, but carried the firm, unquestionable authority of someone who absolutely did not want a public scene. "Ma'am," the guard whispered strictly, leaning in close to my ear, "I am going to have to politely ask you to step back and immediately relocate to the standing area at the very rear of the Grand Hall. The opening ceremony is about to commence in exactly 5 minutes, and we absolutely cannot have any disruptions blocking the main thoroughfare." The sheer unfairness of the entire situation threatened to completely crush my spirit right then and there. My heart pounded a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs, a physical manifestation of the immense anger I had forcefully swallowed for 15 long, agonizing years. I looked down at the crumpled white name card bearing my name, which was now shoved callously under Eleanor's heavy designer leather purse. I could have screamed loudly. I could have caused a massive scene that would be gossiped about and remembered for decades. But I instantly thought of Leo. I thought of the countless, exhausting hours he had spent studying endlessly at our wobbly, scratched kitchen table, preparing diligently for this exact momentous day. I absolutely refused to tarnish his well-deserved moment of glory with my own bitter battles. "Of course," I quietly replied to the imposing guard, my voice remarkably steady despite the violent tremor shaking my hands. "I will move to the back right now." I turned silently on my heel and began the agonizingly long walk back up the crowded aisle, the delicate yellow daisies trembling slightly in my tight grip. Every single step away from the front row felt like a massive physical weight pressing down heavily on my shoulders. I finally found a small, shadowy, unnoticed corner near the heavy wooden exit doors at the very back of the massive auditorium. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders proudly against the cold brick wall. From this distant vantage point, Arthur and Eleanor were nothing but well-dressed specks. Bathed in the artificial, blinding glow of the stage lights, they truly thought they had won. They truly thought they had successfully pushed me entirely into the dark shadows, completely erasing my existence and my monumental sacrifices. I took a deep, steadying breath, the subtle, earthy scent of the yellow daisies firmly grounding me in reality. I anchored myself in the present moment, locking my eyes fiercely on the empty wooden podium where my son would soon stand. My pulse slowly began to steady. The sting of being displaced was incredibly sharp, but the quiet, enduring strength I had forged through years of solitary hardship was infinitely stronger. I waited silently in the shadows, letting the quiet tension build, absolutely certain that the truth could never remain buried forever. The harsh fluorescent lights of the auditorium corridor buzzed softly above me, a stark contrast to the warm, dim glow of the solitary desk lamp I used to work under 15 years ago. Standing there in the shadows, my mind inevitably drifted back to our cramped, unheated basement apartment. Those walls had witnessed thousands of hours of my youth slipping away. Back then, I was fueled by blind devotion and countless cups of cheap black coffee. I spent night after night hunched over a second-hand sewing machine, the rhythmic clatter of its needle the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the early morning hours. Arthur was just an aspiring designer with grand visions but absolutely zero technical skill. He had the charm to pitch ideas, but I was the one who breathed life into his empty sketches. I developed a unique, interlocking structural weave, a method that gave delicate fabrics the strength of structured garments without losing their ethereal flow. It was a painstaking process, requiring a mathematical precision that I mapped out by hand, thread by thread, while Arthur slept soundly in the next room. I had foolishly believed we were building a future together. I believed every single lie he whispered about our shared destiny when he took my physical samples and detailed pattern books to his investor meetings. I did not know that behind my back, he was filing legal patents and copyright registrations for my signature weaving techniques entirely under his own name. He used my genius as the absolute foundation to launch his luxury label, Creston Attire. The brand exploded into the high fashion scene almost overnight. Critics praised his revolutionary approach to fabric manipulation, entirely ignorant of the woman bleeding over the loom in a freezing basement. The moment the company secured its first multi-million-dollar international distribution deal, the illusion of our partnership shattered completely. Arthur did not celebrate with me. Instead, he coldly handed me divorce papers wrapped in dense, impenetrable legal jargon. The betrayal was so sudden, so surgically precise, that it left me completely paralyzed. He had meticulously funneled all the business assets into offshore accounts and hidden corporate structures, leaving the massive debts we accumulated during the startup phase entirely in my name. The legal fees to fight him would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, money I simply did not possess. In a matter of weeks, I was utterly discarded, left to navigate personal bankruptcy and the terrifying reality of raising young Leo completely alone. I had to rebuild my entire existence from absolutely nothing, swallowing my pride and burying my grief. I took the first job I could find, an exhausting, back-breaking position in the wardrobe department of the Vanguard Stage Company. While Creston Attire was outfitting Hollywood elites on international red carpets, I was furiously repairing torn theatrical costumes and scrubbing heavy stage makeup out of cheap velvet curtains. It was a grueling, unforgiving environment. I worked double shifts, sometimes clocking 70 or 80 hours a single week, just to keep a roof over our heads and food on our small kitchen table. The physical toll was immense and unforgiving. The continuous, intricate hand sewing required for historical stage garments rapidly degraded my eyesight. I had to buy increasingly thick, expensive prescription glasses just to see the eye of my needle. My hands, once smooth and nimble, transformed into landscapes of deep, hardened calluses and permanent, dark needle pricks. There were countless nights when I would silently tape up my raw, bleeding fingertips just so I could finish a rush order before the morning rehearsal. But every single drop of blood, every hour of lost sleep, had a singular, unshakable purpose. I poured every spare penny I earned into an ironclad savings account for Leo. I knew he possessed a brilliant analytical mind, and I was absolutely determined to pay the exorbitant tuition for the prestigious State Science Academy. Throughout all those years of agonizing struggle, Arthur did not contribute a single cent of financial support. Whenever the court-ordered mediation demanded he pay his fair share of child-rearing expenses, his team of high-priced corporate lawyers would present carefully doctored financial statements. Arthur would look the judge right in the eye and claim his business expenses were incredibly tight, stating that the company was going through a volatile restructuring phase and he simply could not afford child support. Yet, only weeks later, glossy magazine covers would feature him and Eleanor purchasing their third extravagant, multi-million-dollar mansion in the exclusive, gated community of Viridian Estates. They paraded their stolen wealth across television screens and social media, drinking vintage champagne on yachts while I scrounged for loose change to buy Leo a new pair of winter boots. The contrast was a daily, suffocating cruelty, a bitter poison I had to consciously refuse to drink so it would not infect my son. I absorbed the pain, transforming my quiet suffering into a silent, impenetrable shield around Leo, making sure he never felt the crushing weight of his father's despicable greed. A sudden hush fell over the expansive room as the heavy velvet curtains parted. From my concealed vantage point by the heavy oak doors, I watched my son stride purposefully onto the brightly lit stage. Leo moved with a quiet, undeniable confidence, his dark graduation gown catching the harsh, glaring spotlights. He did not look at the roaring crowd. He did not smile for the hundreds of flashing cameras capturing the momentous occasion. Instead, his sharp, analytical eyes immediately began a systematic, methodical sweep of the cavernous room. He was searching for me. I knew the exact algorithmic precision of his gaze. He scanned the wide center aisles, checked the elevated side balconies, and finally dropped his focus to the designated section right below the podium. Seeing his intense, laser-focused concentration pulled me violently backward into a deeply heartbreaking memory from when he was just 12 years old. It was the absolute dead of winter, during a brutal, record-breaking freeze that had coated our thin apartment windows in thick layers of solid ice. I had desperately taken on an impossibly large, complex commission from the stage company, pushing myself dangerously past the absolute limits of human physical exhaustion just to ensure his upcoming spring tuition installment would be fully covered. I had been working continuously for 48 straight hours, without a single wink of sleep. My exhausted, trembling body eventually gave out completely. I collapsed heavily against the violently vibrating metal table of the industrial sewing machine, my head resting dangerously close to the needle, while the heavy motor was still fiercely humming. I woke up several hours later in the dim, freezing morning light, utterly confused and disoriented. The loud mechanical roar of the machine had been cleanly shut off. A heavy, severely worn wool blanket, the one usually kept on his own small bed, was tucked securely and warmly around my shivering shoulders. But it was my hands that truly made my breath hitch in my dry throat. My fingers, which had previously been raw, blistered, and actively bleeding from dozens of slipped needle punctures, had been meticulously cleaned of all dried blood. Small, perfectly cut square patches of sterile white gauze were wrapped securely and precisely around every single wound, held in place with tight strips of medical tape. Leo had found me completely broken and unconscious. Instead of waking me up in a panic or crying out in fear, my 12-year-old boy had clinically assessed the grim situation. He had quietly retrieved our cheap plastic first aid kit from the tiny bathroom and tended to my battered hands with the gentle, incredibly steady precision of a seasoned field medic. He never said a single spoken word about the incident the next morning. He simply poured my bitter black coffee and silently packed his own paper bag school lunch. It was a profound, silent pact of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of my pain that sealed our unbreakable bond forever. That same quiet, intensely analytical stoicism defined his entire adolescence, especially regarding the rigidly court-mandated weekend visitations to his father. The ironclad legal agreement forced him to spend exactly 48 hours every single month at the sprawling, opulent estate compound. Arthur would constantly attempt to dazzle him, throwing thousands of dollars around by purchasing ridiculously expensive sports cars, the latest imported virtual reality consoles, and ordering extravagant, private catered meals. Yet, Leo remained completely and utterly impervious to the hollow, flashy luxury. He treated his biological father with a chillingly polite, almost corporate detachment, answering invasive questions in brief, highly factual sentences that offered absolutely zero emotional vulnerability. He never once touched the towering piles of extravagant, brightly wrapped gifts. Instead, he would manufacture incredibly logical, scientifically flawless excuses about complex advanced physics assignments or impending university laboratory deadlines just to cut those dreadful visits short. He would arrive back at our cramped, drafty apartment hours earlier than expected, immediately dropping his heavy backpack and rolling up his cotton sleeves. Without ever being asked, he would walk straight into my chaotic makeshift workroom, grab a heavy bristle broom, and quietly spend the entire afternoon sweeping up the massive, suffocating piles of fabric dust and loose cotton threads that constantly choke the air we breathed. His quiet, physical actions spoke volumes louder than any grandiose declaration of familial loyalty ever could. Now, standing proudly on the absolute pinnacle of his academic career, that exact same perceptive, piercing gaze locked onto the very center of the front row. Even from the extreme back corner of the massive auditorium, I could practically see the complex intellectual gears shifting rapidly behind his dark brown eyes. He instantly registered the empty velvet cushioned space where I should have been sitting. He registered the small, crushed white cardboard name card that was now barely visible, shoved disrespectfully under the sharp edge of a designer leather handbag. And finally, he registered Eleanor. He saw her sitting triumphantly in my stolen seat, arrogantly wearing the specific, intricate silk weave pattern that legally and morally belonged to my own stolen legacy. The physical transformation on his face was incredibly subtle. entirely invisible to the thousands of cheering parents and oblivious school faculty members surrounding him, but to me, it was as deafening as a violent thunderclap. The relaxed, proud posture of a triumphant high school graduate instantly vanished into thin air. His strong jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, grinding his teeth together. A profound, icy stillness washed over his handsome features, completely replacing the joyful, youthful anticipation with a hardened, surgical resolve. It was the exact same cold, highly calculated expression he wore that freezing winter night when he silently bandaged my bleeding, ruined fingers. It was the dangerous look of a brilliant young man who had spent his entire conscious life quietly observing a grand, agonizing injustice, and had just right then finalized the exact mathematical equation required to ruthlessly correct it. My son slowly turned his head away from the arrogant woman in the front row and deliberately stepped forward toward the tall center microphone, his profound silence carrying the terrifying, undeniable weight of an impending hurricane. The distinguished female principal stepped confidently up to the polished wooden podium, adjusting her heavy metal microphone with a sharp, piercing squeal of feedback that momentarily silenced the restless crowd. She smoothed down her dark academic robes and beamed with a practiced, intensely radiant pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice booming majestically across the cavernous space, "it is my absolute honor and immense privilege to introduce this year's graduating class valedictorian. This remarkable young man has not only achieved a perfect 4.0 grade point average over 4 highly demanding academic years, but he has recently garnered unprecedented international acclaim. His senior capstone project, a globally groundbreaking innovation in sustainable material engineering, has already secured preliminary patent reviews. He has single-handedly developed a revolutionary synthetic biopolymer weave, a microscopic structural foundation that significantly increases textile tensile strength while simultaneously reducing industrial environmental waste by over 85%. The thunderous, deafening applause had barely begun to ripple through the massive auditorium before Arthur leaped aggressively and triumphantly to his feet. From my isolated corner in the shadows, I watched his desperately pathetic display of performative fatherhood. He aggressively buttoned his custom-tailored charcoal suit jacket and began clapping with exaggerated theatrical motions, making absolutely certain that every single person seated in the first 15 rows noticed his imposing physical presence. He dramatically turned side to side, offering tight, self-satisfied nods to the local politicians and school board members seated nearby. He was shamelessly soaking up the ambient glory, practically broadcasting a loud, silent message that this staggering intellectual achievement was entirely the expected byproduct of his own flawless genetic lineage. Eleanor remained seated right beside him, clapping with stiff, highly practiced, polite enthusiasm. Arthur's sheer audacity, happily taking public credit for a boy he had abandoned both financially and emotionally, made my stomach churn violently. The overwhelming applause slowly faded into an expectant, hushed murmur as my son smoothly approached the center stage. He moved with a heavy, undeniable grace, stopping precisely behind the tall microphone stand. He calmly reached into the inner breast pocket of his dark graduation robe and deliberately withdrew a neat, thick stack of pristine white index cards. I recognized them instantly. They contained the carefully sanitized, cheerfully optimistic valedictorian speech that the strict school administration had officially approved just 72 hours prior. Leo held the crisp cards up for a brief, incredibly silent moment, staring intensely at the neatly typed words. Then, with a sudden, shockingly violent motion that echoed loudly through the highly sensitive microphone system, he gripped the entire heavy stack and ripped them completely in half. A collective, sharp gasp violently rippled through the massive audience as he calmly dropped the ruined, fluttering pieces of paper directly into the dark plastic wastebasket sitting right beside the podium. He leaned in incredibly close to the microphone, his strong knuckles visibly turning bone white as he gripped the sharp edges of the wooden stand. When he finally spoke, his voice was absolutely not the nervous, unsure tone of a high school student, but rather the resonant, commanding boom of a seasoned prosecutor delivering a damning opening statement. True, world-changing innovation, Leo declared, his deep voice effortlessly slicing through the heavy air of the room like a freshly sharpened steel blade, can never, under any conceivable circumstances, be built upon a hollow, rotting foundation of cowardly, calculated theft. The sheer, raw force and utterly unexpected hostility of his words hit the enormous audience like a massive physical blow. The wealthy benefactors in the VIP front rows shifted uncomfortably in their expensive velvet seats, immediately exchanging nervously bewildered glances. The principal visibly stiffened directly behind him, her radiant smile freezing into a tight mask of absolute terror as she instinctively reached a shaking hand out. The colossal space was instantly plunged into a paralyzing silence. Nobody dared to cough or shift their weight. The widespread confusion rapidly morphed into a thick, palpable tension that made the very oxygen in the room feel incredibly heavy to breathe. Leo completely ignored the mounting panic radiating from the anxious school officials sitting directly behind his back. He deliberately lifted his chin, staring coldly over the tops of the heads of the thousands of seated guests. He entirely bypassed the roped-off sponsor section. His sharp eyes aggressively ignored Arthur's deeply confused frown and Eleanor's nervous twitching. Instead, that deeply familiar, piercing gaze traveled the entire massive length of the grand hall, cutting a straight, unwavering path directly through the vast ocean of human faces until it locked perfectly onto the forgotten corner by the rear exit doors. He found me standing perfectly still there, pressed stubbornly against the cold brick wall, my tired hands tightly gripping the $12 bouquet of bright yellow daisies. Without breaking eye contact with me for even a fraction of a second, Leo slowly raised his right arm. He extended his index finger, pointing directly, unmistakably, and completely unapologetically right at my face. The bold, dramatic gesture acted like a massive magnetic force, instantly compelling over 4,000 heads to snap backward, their intensely curious eyes searching the dim shadows to see exactly who he was targeting. The distinguished woman currently standing completely marginalized by the exit doors, Leo proclaimed, his steady voice dripping with an overwhelming, fierce pride that vibrated the very structural foundations of the massive building. That remarkably strong woman is my mother, and she is the singular, undeniable reason I possess both the intellectual capacity and the unyielding moral fortitude to stand on this academic podium of glory today. The collective, burning stare of the enormous crowd crashed into my fragile body all at once, violently stripping away the dark invisibility I had desperately sought, leaving me completely exposed under the sudden blinding weight of his magnificent public revelation, the sustainable biopolymer matrix that the administration just praised. He announced, the acoustics of the hall carrying his crisp consonants into every corner, is not some sudden stroke of solitary brilliance. It is merely a chemical translation of a revolutionary mechanical textile weave engineered exactly 15 years ago. My entire award-winning capstone project takes 100% of its direct inspiration from the unrecognized, stolen genius of my mother. The collective gasp from the thousands of seated guests was an audible wave of shock. I stood frozen by the exit doors, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Leo leaned even closer to the microphone. And it is fundamentally necessary to expose the truth today because the very foundation of this academic ceremony is compromised by deceit. The luxury label, Creston Attire, proudly listed as the primary financial sponsor of today's event, is a complete and total fraud. The entire front row seemed to violently flinch. The wealthy benefactors twisted in their seats, staring in horror at Arthur. Leo delivered the fatal, meticulously planned blow with the chilling calm of an executioner. The man who calls himself my father, the man sitting in the premium sponsor seat, has built a multi-million-dollar global empire entirely on a foundation of blatant intellectual property theft. Every single signature structural technique, every foundational patent that launched Creston Attire into the high-fashion stratosphere was ruthlessly stolen from Violet Bell. He took her original blueprints, silenced her legally, and stamped his own fraudulent name on her life's work. The auditorium instantly erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs. The tension snapped like a fragile thread under immense pressure. Down in the center of the VIP section, the facade of aristocratic composure violently shattered. Eleanor's heavily contoured face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, ghostly white before flushing violently with a deep, furious crimson. She could not contain the explosive, humiliating rage boiling inside her. Ignoring all social decorum, she leaped violently to her feet, knocking her expensive leather handbag onto the polished floor. "You are a pathetic, lying little boy," Eleanor shrieked at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice slicing horribly through the rising noise of the crowd. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger furiously at the stage. "How dare you stand up there and slander your father? You are making up these absurd, jealous lies just to defend a bitter, miserable, washed-up woman who could never accept her own pathetic failures." Her hysterical outburst echoed terribly across the vast room. Arthur frantically grabbed at the hem of her shimmering silk dress, his face a mask of absolute terrified panic, desperately whispering at her to sit down and shut up. But Eleanor violently yanked her fabric away from his grasping hands, hyperventilating with uncontrolled rage. Up on the stage, Leo did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or match her screaming hysteria. Instead, he reached calmly into the pocket of his dark academic gown and retrieved a small, black plastic presentation remote. Without saying a single word, he pressed a button. Behind him, the massive, state-of-the-art digital projection screen, originally intended to display the school crest, flared brightly to life. The sudden burst of light illuminated the entire stage. Projected at 50 feet wide was a high-resolution scan of an old, faded, heavily worn notebook page. "What you see behind me," Leo stated, his steady voice cutting effortlessly over Eleanor's lingering shrieks, "is the original, primary blueprint for the interlocking geometric weave that launched Creston Attire. Please direct your attention to the bottom right corner of the document." He clicked the remote again. The image on the massive screen dramatically zoomed in on the margin of the yellowed paper. There, written in bold, unmistakable blue ink, was a date from 16 years ago, accompanied by the clear, official stamp of a state public notary. Right below the timestamp was my distinct, cursive signature, Violet Bell. "These documents," Leo continued, his tone clinical and utterly devastating, "were filed and dated 3 full years before Arthur ever registered the company, but paper evidence is easily dismissed by expensive lawyers. So, I will provide a physical demonstration." He clicked the remote a third time. The screen flashed, displaying a highly magnified, microscopic photograph of a shimmering silk fabric. It was a dense, complex arrangement of crossing threads, a beautiful but highly technical structure. "My mother knew she was working with a man she could not fully trust," Leo declared loudly, his eyes locking directly onto Eleanor, who was now standing completely frozen in the aisle, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. "So, she engineered a permanent microscopic flaw directly into the mathematical algorithm of her weaving technique. It is a highly specific, intentional drop stitch that occurs exactly every 2,400 threads." Leo clicked the remote one final time. The microscopic image zoomed in further, highlighting the intentional structural anomaly. The dropped stitches perfectly, undeniably formed 2 distinct, interlocking letters hidden deep within the fabric matrix, a capital V and a capital B. "It is a structural watermark," Leo explained flawlessly to the stunned, breathless crowd. "A signature literally woven into the DNA of the fabric itself. A signature that the brilliant Arthur never even noticed when he stole the design, and therefore never removed from the automated manufacturing process." Leo paused, letting the silence heavy the room before delivering the final, crushing strike. "In fact, if anyone in the front row cares to examine the bespoke, outrageously expensive silk dress that Eleanor is wearing at this very moment, you will find those exact intertwined initials hidden within the pattern on her left shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely catastrophic for Arthur and Eleanor. The thousands of audience members exploded into a deafening roar of astonishment, outrage, and undisguised disgust. The wealthy politicians and socialites, seated immediately adjacent to them, practically scrambled out of their chairs, physically recoiling as if Eleanor's dress was suddenly engulfed in highly contagious flames. They were completely and totally isolated, suddenly marooned on a tiny, humiliating island surrounded by a turbulent, angry ocean of thousands of judgmental, contemptuous stares. Eleanor looked down at her own shoulder, her hands shaking violently, her chest heaving as the horrifying realization of her absolute public humiliation finally crushed her arrogant spirit. She let out a pathetic, stifled sob, covering her face with both hands. Arthur, finally realizing that his entire carefully constructed life of luxury and lies had just been systematically obliterated in front of the entire city elite, completely abandoned his dignified posture. He raised his expensive suit jacket over his head, desperately trying to shield his face from the hundreds of smartphone cameras that had suddenly been thrust into the air, their flashes firing relentlessly. With the cowardly panic of a cornered rat, he grabbed Eleanor tightly by the arm and violently dragged her stumbling, crying form toward the nearest side exit, fleeing the auditorium under a deafening, unforgiving chorus of boos and furious jeers. Their frantic attempt to escape through the side corridor was abruptly cut short. The very same broad-shouldered security guards who had so politely banished me to the shadows just an hour earlier now formed an impenetrable human wall blocking the heavy oak exit doors. The lead guard, his face a mask of absolute authority, stepped squarely into Arthur's frantic path. "Sir," the guard boomed, his deep voice carrying easily over the chaotic noise of the auditorium. "You and your wife need to immediately vacate these premises. We will not tolerate fraudulent individuals causing a massive disruption during this sacred academic ceremony. You are being officially escorted off the campus grounds right now." Arthur looked completely shattered, his expensive tailored suit now wrinkled as he and his sobbing wife were unceremoniously marched out of the side doors, entirely stripped of their stolen dignity. Up on the stage, the principal and the school board members remained frozen in a state of absolute shock, having delivered his devastating truth. Leo turned his back on the podium. He calmly walked down the short flight of wooden stairs, stepping off the elevated stage and directly onto the main floor. The moment his heavy black dress shoes touched the polished mahogany wood, a profound transformation occurred within the massive crowd. The thousands of whispering guests suddenly fell completely silent. As Leo began to walk deliberately up the long central aisle, the dense ocean of people instinctively parted for him. Wealthy benefactors, proud parents, and stunned students physically stepped aside. Clearing a wide path, they watched him with a mixture of profound awe and deep respect. He did not look at any of them. His fierce, unwavering gaze remained locked entirely on me, bridging the vast distance of the grand hall. Every single step he took resonated with the heavy weight of vindication. I stood paralyzed by the rear exit doors, tears streaming freely down my worn, tired face. I clutched the simple yellow daisies so tightly my knuckles ached. When Leo finally reached the end of the aisle, he stopped right in front of me. He looked down at my rough, calloused hands, the very hands that had bled for his future, and his sharp features suddenly softened into a beautifully warm smile. Leo did not hesitate for a fraction of a second as he reached up to grip the thick ribbon draped around his neck. With deliberate certainty, he removed the weighty, esteemed academic gold medal from his own shoulders, the greatest distinction the Academy could award, the crowning representation of his flawless 4.0 grade point average, shone brilliantly in the shadowy hallway. Moving with deep veneration, he leaned in and carefully slipped the massive gold medal straight around my neck. "These honors do not belong to me," Leo declared loudly, turning slightly so his powerful voice could be heard by the hundreds of people who had followed him to the back of the room. "They belong entirely to you, Mom. Your silent, bleeding sacrifices have finally paid off. We won. Before I could even formulate a sentence through my overwhelming tears of pure joy, the crowd parted once more. 3 sharply dressed individuals confidently approached our small corner. The lead figure, a tall woman with intelligent eyes, stopped a respectful distance away and offered a deep, highly polite bow. "Ms. Bell," she said, her voice completely calm and strictly professional. "My name is Sarah, and I represent the Senior Executive Board of a leading global sustainable technology corporation. We were in the audience today observing the valedictorian presentation. We have just witnessed the absolute brilliance of your foundational geometric weave designs. We would like to formally request an immediate meeting to discuss purchasing the exclusive rights to your original textile patents. We are fully prepared to offer a massive, 8-figure financial compensation package to secure your revolutionary blueprints." My entire world spun with a sudden clarity. The crushing weight of the past 15 years completely evaporated into thin air. I looked at the corporate representatives, then down at the shining gold medal resting against my heart, and finally up at my brilliant son. The realization hit me like a glorious sunrise. Arthur's fraudulent empire was entirely doomed. The irrefutable evidence displayed today would undoubtedly trigger massive legal investigations for corporate theft and monumental financial fraud. His company would collapse miserably into absolute ruin. Meanwhile, my own future had just suddenly ignited with a brilliant radiance. I reached out and grasped Leo's hand tightly. His grip was infinitely reassuring. "We accept your invitation to talk," I told the executive softly, "but that discussion will happen on our own terms, tomorrow." Turning away from the stunned executives and the lingering stares of the massive crowd, Leo and I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the auditorium. We stepped together directly into the crisp, bright morning sunlight. The fresh air filled my lungs, washing away the toxic atmosphere of the wealthy elite. We strode freely and proudly down the long concrete path, permanently leaving the dark ashes of Arthur's fake pride entirely in our wake. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.